gotta say, you're welcome. It's complicated. And how do you feel about this? Hi there, it's Brett Hornby here, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. And you can already see with the thumbnail and double blue in the background, I'm gonna do a bonus video for On the Road to the Grey Cup. Let's do a quick recap of the 111th Grey Cup between the Toronto Argonauts and the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. And not to be anticlimactic, the 111th Grey Cup to crown the champion of the Canadian Football League for the 2024 season goes to the Toronto Argonauts. And while you could say not surprised at the main result, let's say I'm surprised on how we got there. But before we get to the game, if you want to follow along with this Calgary sports fans journey, just make sure you hit like, subscribe, and my other social media links down in the description below. And part of the you're welcome that I've said in the opening is, as a Calgary sports fan, it seems like we like to improve the Toronto Argonauts, starting with, making the trade to send them Doug Gilmour for Gary Leeman, or lost Doug Flutie after Larry Rickman got in trouble after he got in some financial trouble. Flutie left Calgary for Toronto. Well, if you look at the Grey Cup this year, a lot of former Calgary Stampeders made an impact for the Toronto Argonauts, and that's where I have to say you're welcome. And then the how to feel and it's complicated is going to come into play about how do you feel about both teams. So ultimately, in the 111th Grey Cup in Vancouver, I'm recording this a couple hours after the game, and a little rough. Enjoy the Grey Cup, stay up late on Sunday night, so I need to take Monday off. And sadly, I was sitting and watching it right here, not at the game, but can't seem to go to every Grey Cup. But the Toronto Argonauts, they won this one 41-24. So it was also a big win and a lot of points on the board. We were expecting a close, tight game. Started off that way, as after the first quarter, actually the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, they had a 7-3 lead. After the first quarter, Winnipeg had a 10-9 lead after the second quarter. And actually, briefly, the game was tied at 10 apiece as the Toronto Argonauts made a long punt, and the Winnipeg Blue Bombers elected to give up a single, or we call a rouge, for the field position. And then it was 17-13 for Toronto after the third quarter, and such a few moments that game could have swayed the other way. And while ultimately the Toronto Argonauts had a big lead, and who stood out, which I'm going to say a lot of former these guys helped out, but the 41-24 victory for the Toronto Argonauts, well, a big part of that was Toronto capitalized and got 27 points off of turnovers, while only Winnipeg capitalized 6 points off of turnovers. And that's why I say it's definitely is an upset, both on the Toronto Argonauts winning their 19th Grey Cup in franchise history, and upset the Winnipeg Blue Bombers because they were the better team. Winnipeg making their fifth straight trip to the Grey Cup, but they are now lost the last 3 straight. Many could say it felt like with the game in Vancouver and the crowd, it was definitely more of a pro-Winnipeg crowd, I would say. Especially, it was probably easier for Bomber fans to make the trip than Argonaut fans, the ones that are around, and just based on who had the ball, you could tell who was on defense. So that's just the quick numbers on the box score. We'll break down the player stats and some key moments that led to it. So the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, they were the home team, so I'll go over them first, and these numbers probably could tell the defense wins championships, and I'm going to say defense definitely stood up big time for the Toronto Argonauts for the second, or you could probably say the third straight week, because that's how the Toronto Argonauts snuffed out the Montreal Alouettes last week in the East Final, and snuffed out the Ottawa Red Blacks and put up big numbers once again in Toronto when they were playing in the East semi-final. But the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, Zach Collaros, well, first quarterback and that started in 5 straight Grey Cups. You could say it was the first quarterback you might take a look at and think, well, Edmonton, they won 5 straight Grey Cups, and went to 6 straight. Well, they also had Tom Wilkinson in there amongst it, Warren Moon. So Zach Collaros, well, he looked very, very ordinary, and you could probably say he was dealing with an injured hand that probably played a role in the fourth quarter. He was 15 for 30 in passing, so only 50%. 202 yards, no touchdowns, but 4 interceptions. And he injured his hand about 2 minutes to go in the third quarter. Got caught up in a Toronto defender, and Toronto defense definitely battle-tested the Winnipeg Blue Bombers to the point that there was blood on Zach Collaros' hand. He had to run out and get repairs on his throwing hand, and tried it with the glove and without the glove. That played a role probably in a couple of his interceptions. And then Brady Oliveira, he actually, for his standards, I'm going to say he looked very ordinary. He had 11 carries for 84 yards, but given that he's the top Canadian and most outstanding player, so a touchdown, that's probably a bad game for Brady Oliveira's standards, but tells you how good Toronto defense was. The other touchdown that was scored by the Winnipeg Blue Bombers was their backup quarterback, and Terry Wilson. He had 1 carry for 3 yards in their rushing touchdown. That was actually in the first quarter when the Winnipeg Blue Bombers were able to take their lead in the first half. And actually, Terry Wilson did play a series, did not complete any passes when Zach Collaros was getting his hand repaired to get patched up to go back into the game. But by that time, it felt like the momentum was switching. And then the leading receiver, well, the only player that really stood out was rookie Ontario Wilson. He had 5 catches for 99 yards. Kenny Lawler was grounded, as well as Nick Dembski. He was the leading receiver. The next leading receiver, if you look at the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, didn't have 30 yards receiving. And then on the defense side of the ball, there were still a few players to note on the highlight, because Nick Arbuckle, the quarterback who got forced into action and started the Grey Cup for his first playoff game, he did have a solid game, but he wasn't perfect. On the other hand, well, Terrell Ford, who actually is Trey Ford's brother, he led the team with 6 defensive tackles. And Willie Jefferson, he actually still had a solid game. He had 6 defensive tackles, 2 sacks, 1 interception, 1 fumble recovery. And then Tyrell Bonds did have an interception in the third quarter to try to maybe get momentum back on the Winnipeg Blue Bombers side. And then Sergio Castillo, for the kicker for the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, he was perfect, 3 for 3, and 40 yards was the longest. So those are the numbers for the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. The other thing you can also highlight that not only the Toronto Argonauts were able to stop the run and cover the receivers and pick up a few interceptions, including 4. One big play that also happened in the Grey Cup was wrapping up the third quarter, where I mentioned the Toronto Argonauts had a 17-13 lead at the time. Well, it looked like Toronto was going to punt the ball away, and Winnipeg did look like initially they blocked it. However, one rule that actually hurt the Winnipeg Blue Bombers was you can't interfere with a player to go scramble for a fumble recovery on a block punt. And actually Winnipeg got caught with interference in the punt recovery block that actually forced it to be a first down for the Toronto Argonauts, because it was around the Toronto 30-yard line where that block punt happened, that if Winnipeg would have recovered and maintained possession without that interference, we might have had a different football game. Regardless, if Zach Collaros, at that time Zach Collaros was still getting pairs on his hand, but that's where part of the mistakes happened with the Winnipeg Blue Bombers that helped the Toronto Argonauts. But if you look at the Toronto Argonauts side of the ball, well, Nick Arbuckle, the quarterback, who actually familiar with him as a Calgary Stampeders fan, as he did play in his first chunk of his starts was with the Calgary Stampeders in 2019. He was 26 for 37 in passing. He threw for 252 yards. Well, I mean that he did not have a perfect game. He threw for 2 interceptions, as I mentioned, that Willie Jefferson and Terrell Bonds had an interception each. I mean, the Terrell Bonds interception was when Nick Arbuckle was throwing deep. And then the other interception that Willie Jefferson got kind of probably surprised him, because he's actually more of a specialist when it comes to deflecting passes, and he deflected the pass and then he deflected it to his chest to say, oh, I guess I got an interception, I got to run with it. So, Kadeem, as I say, Nick Arbuckle still had a better game as quarterback. He did actually first started off managing the game, but he did actually was able to stretch out the Toronto Argonauts and get some big plays. Kadeem Carey, he had 15 carries for 79 yards and a touchdown. Another former Stampeder that made a big plays for the Toronto Argonauts for this one. And then the leading receiver, actually Nick Arbuckle was able to spread the ball around, so a few receivers stood out for this one. But Dijon Brissett, actually I was going to say, spoiler alert, Nick Arbuckle got the Grey Cup MVP and Dijon Brissett got the top Canadian for the 111th Grey Cup. He was the lead receiver for Toronto. He had 3 catches, 45 yards and a touchdown, while Mackay Polk, he had the rookie who had over 1,000 yards this season, had 4 catches for 42 yards. And then Kev Mateo, who also had a touchdown on 2 catches, 23 yards. So that's the offensive side of things for the Toronto Argonauts, where they got a touchdown. One, Kadeem Carey ran it in, and then Dijon Brissett and Kevin Ty, their medal, each had a receiving touchdown. But the defensive side of the ball, well, another former Stampeder in Winston McManus, he had 6 defensive tackles, 1 interception, and it looked like he was about to run a pick 6 back, but he was just short and got tripped up, which ultimately set up the Kadeem Carey touchdown run. And then Benji Franklin, what a playoff he's had. He had another interception in this game on 3 defensive tackles and almost had one in the Winnipeg end zone to potentially snuff out Winnipeg's offensive comeback. And then, another former Calgary Stampeder in Deshaun Amos. He had 2 defensive tackles and an interception. But the big interception that also broke the back for the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, and actually was one of the longest pick 6s in Grey Cup history with the turn, was Robert Pinster, who had an interception and a pick 6. And then Liram Harla, who actually, he was 4 for 4 field goals, 45 yards being the longest. He actually got a little banged up in a play after he made the second field goal in the first half. And then when Toronto actually got the interception to set up yet another field goal, Liram Harla was a little bit in pain, but he still was able to kick the 45-yard field goal. And as I mentioned, Nick Arbuckle got the Most Outstanding Player Award, and Dijon Brissett got the top Canadian. So, to kind of summarize this game, it was basically Winnipeg faltered because the Toronto defense made the run attack look ordinary. Their big play receivers were snuffed out, and I'm going to say Nick Dembski as well as Kenny Lawler who are the big play receivers for the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, they recovered very, very well. And the fact that the mistakes that the Winnipeg Blue Bombers made ultimately led to Toronto scoring points, because there was another point in the second half that it was another former Calgary Stampeder. Surprise, surprise. There was a return that Lucky Whitehead for the Winnipeg Blue Bombers lost the ball when Fraser Sopik punched out the ball, and it led to, I believe it was a field goal that the Toronto Argonauts was able to score. And then mentioned when the Winnipeg Blue Bombers recovered or blocked the punt, it was wiped out with the return on the interference on the recovery. So if you look at the highlights, you know what I mean. Well, basically the Toronto Argonauts, just like they've done all through the playoffs, they got just enough offense, and the fact that it was their backup quarterback that took over, and basically their defense made the big plays. And the offense did stretch out the field a few times, but there were times that the Toronto Argonauts, for the most part, I'm going to say, played a game to manage the game. But I'm going to say, for the case, when you go back to looking at last week when Chad Kelly got injured and Nick Arbuckle was forced to be in, he wasn't quite as starstruck when, let's say, Ryan Dinwiddie, who was making his first professional start, who is the current coach of the Toronto Argonauts, and may also add in, he used to coach here in Calgary as the quarterbacks coach, where he was familiar with Nick Arbuckle, where he started 25 games, and talking about Nick Arbuckle and made his first playoff start, so at least he has some professional starts in his career. But Ryan Dinwiddie at the time was making his first professional start back in 2007, which was the 95th Grey Cup that Winnipeg Blue Bombers lost. So maybe there was some of that connection that Ryan Dinwiddie was able to compose Nick Arbuckle, but he didn't seem too phased by the big stage. I shall say, in the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, I'm going to still say they had more pressure on them, being the fact that they were the favorites, and the fact that they were in the 5th straight Grey Cup. Which brings in the its complicated part when you take a look at the Grey Cup legacy. I mean, when you first look at the team that won, the Toronto Argonauts, this was their second win in 3 years. So let's hypothetically say, if the Toronto Argonauts win the Grey Cup next year for 3 out of 4, people now say the definition of a modern dynasty is if you win 3 championships in 4 years. Would you consider this Toronto Argonauts a dynasty? Considering how they've won it, and they've had a lot of turnover. I mean, it was McLeod Bethel Thompson that was quarterback 2 years ago that led the Toronto Argonauts to the Grey Cup, and then ultimately it was Chad Kelly that finished the game because McLeod Bethel Thompson was hurt. And then last year, Chad Kelly and the Toronto Argonauts were 16-2, but then they got upset in the East Final against Montreal. And then this year, you had Cameron Dukes started most of the first half. Nick Arbuckle was signed in as, insurance policy before Chad Kelly was eligible to come back in the second half of the season. And Toronto looked like they were starting to slowly build up. And the fact that Chad Kelly got hurt in the East Final last week to force Nick Arbuckle in as the starter. There's just been totally different players, because a lot of players have been in and out of the lineup. So there hasn't been like a core. Ryan Dinwiddie has been the coach for the last 4 years. So that's why I say it'd be complicated if you can look at this Toronto Argonauts team as a dynasty, let's say if they win next year. And then if you go back to my preview video, when I looked at, Grey Cup records and history, and then history of Grey Cups played in Vancouver, well, this is the 19th overall Grey Cup for the Toronto Argonauts in franchise history. They are now 19-6. in Grey Cups. I mean, this is their second in 3 years because they last won it in 2022. Finley against the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. Well, Toronto's now 8-0 in Grey Cups when they played the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. And then the 1942 game where they had the Royal Canadian Air Force Hurricanes for the Toronto and the Royal Canadian Air Force Bombers for Winnipeg, Toronto won that Grey Cup. So Toronto's always beaten Winnipeg for the Grey Cup. So it's funny how that history's played out, but this was a bigger defeat this year than it was 2 years ago in 2022. And one thing I forgot to look up is actually this is the 8th straight Grey Cup appearance that Toronto's won. Starting in 1991, which as a Stampeder fan definitely familiar with that team. And actually interestingly, that was when the Toronto Argonauts, they won in Winnipeg in one of the coldest games ever. Calgary outplayed Toronto, but the big memorable play was Rocket Ishmael with the punt return for a touchdown, and someone in Winnipeg tried to throw a beer can at him, but he had the star-studded ownership by the late actor in John Candy, and then Bruce McNall, and then you might have heard this hockey player named Wayne Gretzky. That was that team, started with that. So when it adds to the Toronto Argonauts, they have won the last 8 straight Grey Cup appearances. The last Grey Cup that they lost in was 1987 when they lost to the Edmonton Eskimos. And then you gotta say this definitely has to cement the legacy for Ryan Dinwiddie, being looked upon as one of the great coaches in the league already, as he has been the head coach for Toronto the last 4 years. 3 out of 4 years he's coached them to a division title, and then 2 Grey Cup wins. Big part on developing the quarterbacks that he got to work with. And then for Nick Arbuckle's legacy, I mean, he was here in 2018, 2019, and we looked upon him as potentially as the next one to really place Bo, but we still had Bo, Levi Mitchell that is, and that Nick Arbuckle, actually I think I recall, he was on the practice roster for Calgary and the BC Lions before he had a more predominant role as an active role, first as the short string quarterback in 2018, so he did a great Grey Cup wing as a backup to Bo, and then in 2019 he was 5-2 as a starter filling in for an injured Bo, and then we traded him to Ottawa after the 2019 season, going to 2020, and then that season did not happen. So ultimately, Nick Arbuckle actually was a Toronto Argonaut in 2021. And then late in that season, Toronto traded him to Edmonton. And I believe that trade worked out that when Nick Arbuckle got traded to Edmonton, that there was I think there was rights to Chad Kelly that was exchanged in that transaction to go to Toronto. And then Nick Arbuckle was hanging around in Edmonton. And then last year, he went to Ottawa once again to actually be the starter, and it was clear that Ottawa was going to move on for him, especially with the resurgence of Dustin Crum, but then they decided to go with Drew Brown at quarterback for insurance because they still have Jeremiah Masoli, but he's been suffering the injuries, and the storyline kept going in this season for Nick Arbuckle that he was this close to saying, I'm done playing football, because no one called him, no one signed him until it was, I think it was June or July at the start of the season that the Toronto Argonauts called him because they didn't have a quarterback to wait for Chad Kelly, because I know his last name, I think it's Scott, the last name, for the quarterback that was the third stringer to actually dress for the Grey Cup. He was around with the Toronto Argonauts while they're waiting for Chad Kelly. So you got that legacy too, which now Nick Arbuckle can put on his resume that he's a Grey Cup MLP. Interesting how that works out, how his journey, how he's just been a journeyman, had a hard time finding a home. We looked at possibly maybe him being the next guy after Bo Levi Mitchell. And in an alternate universe, it's one of those what ifs, but gotta look at that. But I'm going to say, going back to the Toronto Argonauts, let's say if they win next year, regardless who they have on the team, can you look at them as a dynasty? Now when it comes to the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, I mean, this was their fifth straight trip to the Grey Cup. They won their first two trips to the Grey Cup in 2019 and 2021. Keep in mind we didn't have a season in 2020. But now Winnipeg has lost the last three Grey Cups. So you can't look at them as a dynasty. I mean, my Calgary Stampeders in the 90s. We went to 5 Grey Cups, but only won 2 of them. Because we went to the Grey Cup in 1991, lost to Toronto. And in 1992, Calgary won the Grey Cup against Winnipeg in Toronto. And then we had 3 15-3 seasons in 1993-94 where we both lost at heartbreaks in the West Final. And then 1995, Calgary went to the Grey Cup but lost to the Baltimore Stallions. So my team has the distinction of being the only team to lose to an American-based team. And then the Calgary Stampeders didn't get back to the Grey Cup to 1998 where they won in Winnipeg against Hamilton. But then they lost against Hamilton in the rematch in BC in 1999, so we went to 5 Grey Cups but only won 2 of them. And then in the 2010s, where we lost in 2012, won in 2014, lost in 16, lost in 17, and won in 18, you could say we went to 4 of the last 5 Grey Cups in that stretch right there. We had 14, 16, 17, 18, or 3 of the last 4. So you couldn't really count Calgary as a dynasty. So in that vein, you can't really count that with the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. And they've had the same core coached by Mike O'Shea. And you had Zach Claros, a quarterback. And then you had Andrew Harris and then Barry Oliveira, both local players that were from the Winnipeg area, went to the same high school. And then you had Nick Dembski and Kenny Lawler on the receivers, and then you had Stanley Bryan and Patrick Neufeld on the offensive line, just to name some of the core. And Willie Jefferson joined that team. I mean, you could still say that when you look at Zach Claros, Mike O'Shea, in terms of Winnipeg Blue Bombers history, you could put Zach Claros almost in the same vein as Kenny Payne. But Kenny Payne won those Grey Cups in the late 1950s and early 1960s. And then for coaching, well, Michael Shea's up there with Cal Murphy and Bud Grant. Bud Grant was the head coach, as well as Cal Murphy won some Grey Cups with Winnipeg, in the late 50s, 60s, and when it comes to Bud Grant, and then Cal Murphy in the 80s and early 90s. But this is where it gets complicated with the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, and then the fact that how do you look at this legacy? I have that same conflicting legacy when it comes to the Calgary Stampeders, where we had Doug Flutie and Jeff Garcia and Henry Burris and even Bo Levi Mitchell. But we did win some cups, but we had some heartbreaks along the way. But you definitely got a feel for the Winnipeg fans that they've been to 5 straight Grey Cups and won the first 2 and lost the last 3. I mean, one fan that still, like I said, every Grey Cup I've been to, Bomber fans sober me up, knowing that they had that drought from 1990 to 2019 of not winning the Grey Cup. And when I was at BC Place, 10 years ago, celebrating hard, watching my Calgary Stampeders winning live, and they defeated Hamilton Targets. And at that time, it was only my 3rd Grey Cup that I went to, and my first one out of town. There was that Bomber fan that came to me, and he said he was jealous of me being a Calgary Stampeders fan and enjoying my team winning, because at that time he was at his 24th Grey Cup, and he hadn't witnessed Winnipeg winning the Grey Cup. Hopefully he eventually got to, at least with 2019 and 2021, but you gotta look at the Winnipeg side of the ball, and then the fact that next year's Grey Cup is going to be in Winnipeg, or to quote Ron Burgundy, the Paris of Canada. So you almost got to say maybe the core next year will probably still want to come back to the Winnipeg Blue Bombers next season, knowing that they're hosting the big game. They want to try to get to the big game. And in case if you're wondering, has a team ever made 6 straight Grey Cup appearances? Well, yes, actually the Edmonton Eskimos from 1977 till 1982 went to 6 straight Grey Cups. They lost the first one in 1977 against the Montreal Alouettes, and that game was in Montreal, and I think that was also the Ice Bowl. At the time, the Olympic Stadium wasn't fully enclosed, and then Edmonton won 5 straight Grey Cups from 1978 to 1982. So it has happened before that a team has made it to 6 straight Grey Cups. But will that be a role, or is Winnipeg Blue Bombers, have they peaked? Because this season, yeah, they were 11-7, finished first in the West, and got to host the West Final. Well, they started the season 0-4 and 2-6. Then they went on that remarkable run. But unfortunately, once again, they got upset by the Toronto Argonauts. You could probably say it's even worse this year, because 2 years ago it was a blocked field goal in a close, hard-fought game. But this year is different. So it's complicated for both sides in terms of will you consider the Toronto Argonauts a dynasty, especially if they win next year, or the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. Let's say if they redeem themselves, get back to the big game and win it at home next year, and then you can say, well, they've won 3 out of 6. So that's where it gets complicated. Looking back at this, and then unfortunately, there is some teams that have lost 3 straight Grey Cups. Winnipeg actually did it from 1945 to 1947, where they lost 3 straight to the Toronto Argonauts. And then actually the Montreal Alouettes in 1954 to 1956, they lost 3 straight Grey Cups. My Calgary Stampeders were in danger of that after they lost in 2016 and 2017, but thankfully we were able to beat Ottawa in 2018 to not get that distinction. And I got to kind of highlight that the Hamilton Tiger Cats, they had a stretch where they've lost 4 out of 5, or 3 out of 4, I should say, because in 1957, 1958, Hamilton lost, and then they lost in 1961, so they had some losses in a short time. Calgary had a stretch where they lost in 1968 and 1970 for winning in 1971. And then Winnipeg Blue Bombers 2022 to 2024. So Winnipeg, you could say, is the first team in CFL history to have 2 different occasions that they've lost in 3 straight Grey Cups. So that's kind of how I feel about recapping the 111th Grey Cup and just looking at their legacy of both teams. That I was thinking in the preview video that it was either going to be Winnipeg will win 3 out of 5, or now unfortunately they're going to be, yeah, we've gone to 5 straight, but we lost the last 3. While the Toronto Argonauts, yeah, they've won 2 out of the last 3. But you got the feel-good story with Nick Arbuckle and his journey. And then how do you look at the Toronto Argonauts, just how they won the Grey Cup, because there's a few players that have stood out, but it's kind of been kind of a platoon, as I should say. And then what to look forward to in the off-season, well, there's definitely going to be a lot of movement, I shall say, and let's say including my Calgary Stampeders, where we've made changes in the coaching staff, where we moved on from Brent Monson, John Simpson, and Mark Killam, and there's definitely speculation on any quarterback changes. And I think with all the speculation of changes happening around the CFL, especially involving my Calgary Stampeders potentially on quarterbacks, free agents, and there's free agency all over, which makes this even credible in the one way how Winnipeg has gone to 5 straight Grey Cups, given the changes in player movement. So I think it might be some videos I'll might make in the off season, but it was definitely an interesting Grey Cup, I shall say. Jonas Brothers halftime was neither good or bad. That's all I gotta say. But as I say, it was disappointing that I wasn't there. But it's a bit tougher to afford things like I used to. Not too sure if I'll be in Winnipeg next year, the Paris of Canada, as Ron Burgundy calls it, but still a little early to look at travel plans. I'm hoping to go back to Toronto in March to catch the Flames on the road, and I must have left some good luck for Toronto. When I went there in August, as the Argonauts, they did beat my Calgary Stampeders, kind of in a similar way how Toronto won the Grey Cup this year, where they made the big plays on defense and special teams, because there was a pick six and a punt return for a touchdown that I got to witness when I was in Toronto. Now it'd just be so weird, let's say if I went to Toronto in March to do the other attractions that I didn't have time and some money to do at the time, because I went to 3 sporting events with the Toronto Argonauts Calgary Stampeders game and the 2 Blue Jay games. I want to go to the Flames Leafs game in Toronto, and if the Toronto Maple Leafs happen to win the Stanley Cup this year, I'm definitely going to have to say you're welcome to Toronto, but I have to say you're welcome to all the former Stampeders that you've employed to help you win the Grey Cup, with Coach Ron Dibley, Nick Arbuckle filling in, Kadeem Carey ran the ball, Wynton McManus being the heart of the defense, Deshaun Amos, Fraser Sopik. I know Royce Mechie also has played a role, but we did trade him for Cam Judge, and let's hopefully Cam Judge can help us win a Grey Cup in 2026. That's when I really want Calgary to win the Grey Cup, but it's complicated to look at both teams and their legacies. So that's my just quick Grey Cup recap, and my feeling on the teams and how the game played out, and just a bonus video for the On the Road to the Grey Cup, as I used to tie that in with my Calgary Stampeders this month, but I don't do the game recaps like I used to with other Calgary sports teams. I don't have time to do that anymore, and I figured it was fitting just to have one because I didn't do it last year, to recap the Grey Cup last year that Montreal won, and then 2 years ago I was too sick to even make all the On the Road to the Grey Cup videos. So as I was going to say, close out, is you want to follow along with this Calgary sports fans journey, just make sure you hit like, subscribe. I have my other social links down in the description below. I do have plans to do some more Calgary sports content in the future. I'm probably going to do an update video outlining plans that I want to do in the winter and going into the spring. Now that, at least for the CFL, it's in the off season now, and then we got hockey season going on with the Flames, Hitman, Wranglers, and then the Roughnecks in the off season, and many other Calgary sports. And I say congratulations to the Toronto Argonauts on winning the Grey Cup. They're second in 3 years, 19th overall, and double blue. I have this orange here because of the games in BC, and orange and white is the colors of the BC Lions. Next year's Grey Cup, the 112th Grey Cup, will be in Winnipeg at Princess Auto Stadium. Paris of Canada. Winnipeg be back there trying to host it and hoist it. They still got some Grey Cup demons, obviously. And then TSN, they were joking that let's say if Toronto Winnipeg play again next year, are they going to call that the Dynasty Bowl? That's just be interesting. And then of course the 113th Grey Cup 2026 will be right here in Calgary, so at least I'll be somewhat guaranteed to go to the Grey Cup in 2 years, but hopefully I'll maybe be there next year if it works out. And if you did go to the Grey Cup in Vancouver, hopefully you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching if you're up to this point. And also the fact, how was Vancouver and the Grey Cup and everything for this year, to put a bow on the 2024 season. And how did you feel about the game, and how do you feel about the legacies of both Winnipeg and Toronto? So I'm going to say, go Stamps go, congratulations Toronto Argonauts, and thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.